Thanks, Jeff, and good morning. Actually, I'm going to have Kaddi start. So Kaddi Gewirtz, she's one of our new master students, and Kaddi's working on a wheat project, looking at a couple different planting dates and weed control options, and really focusing in more on fall applications. So I'm going to have Kaddi talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit after she's done about some of the other things that we've been looking at over the last couple of years and some of our results, and then hopefully open it up to some questions for you. So Kaddi?
Thank you, Christy. I know I'm a new face to many of you, so I'll introduce myself, then we'll have the conversation about weed control in wheat. I'll take any questions, and then I'll give it back to Christy. Like Christy said, I am Kaddi Gewirtz. I am from Perry, Michigan. I grew up on my dad's cash crop farm, and then I went to Michigan State. I graduated ag business and got a minor in agronomy in 2022. I worked in ag retail for a little bit, and then in January is when I started with Christy. And I have the privilege to working on one of these projects. This is my one of two projects. So this is the second year that we are doing this evaluation of fall herbicide applications in wheat. And I know there is a lot of stuff going on this poster, so just bear with me. So kind of why are we doing this, why is it important? So the planting window in winter wheat in Michigan can range anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks. So it kind of makes it difficult for the farmer, and it makes it difficult for managing weeds also. The ideal planting date is, the middle of September, as you can see on the campus. Let me see if I can. The ideal planting date is the middle of September, but with how wet the fall was, we were able to get it in the end of September. So that's not really ideal, but it's what we could do. So this large window also affects, how the wheat grows and how the weed grows. Sorry, one second. As planting dates gets pushed back into later October and even earlier December, it really ranges the question, how do we manage these weeds? And also in the earlier planted wheat, a lot of the growers are asking if we could do a fall herbicide application and eliminate the need for a spring herbicide application. Fall herbicide applications are also becoming very important because in the spring, the temperatures are not warming up and the herbicides are not really working as they should be. And also the wheat canopy closure is becoming extremely closed extremely fast. So when we spray the herbicides, we don't really get the effectiveness. So that's kind of the overview. Like I said earlier, this is the second year that we are doing this research. And we have two locations, one here at the Sprague farm, and then we have the other one at the Michigan State Plant Pathology farm. Our planting dates are up here. Our early is October 4th, and our late is about 4 weeks later at November 3rd. And then 2 weeks after, we did the first herbicide application. So the herbicide applications that we focused on were the top herbicide programs that our farmers followed. And this includes Husky, which is great on mare's tail, chickweed, common whitlow grass, and other annual winter broadleaves. And then also we looked at tank mixes of Husky, Osprey, Husky, and Powerflex. And then additionally, we looked at spring treatments of Husky, Perfect Match, and then Husky and Powerflex. So we have the different application dates. So up here at Sprague, the fall herbicides were applied on November 3rd, and the wheat was around Feeks 1.2, and the temperature at application was about 44 degrees Fahrenheit. And then a few weeks later, we did the second application in the fall, and the wheat was at Feeks 2, and the temperature was about 51 degrees Fahrenheit. And then a few weeks later, the first week of December, we did our later fall application, and the wheat was ranging between Feeks 1 to 1.2, and the temperature was 46 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, that was to the later planted wheat. And then this spring, we were able to spray our spring application on April 18th. You can see that right there. And on April 18th, the wheat was about 9 to 10 inches tall and around Feeks 5. The temperature was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was for the early planted wheat. And for the late planted wheat, the wheat was a little bit shorter. It was about 6 to 8 inches tall, about Feeks 4 and 54 degrees also. And then at Michigan State, at the plant pathology farm, we had a soft red wheat planted down there because the growers usually plant red wheat. And then up here, we have a Mackinac soft white, just to kind of fit the grower programs. And down at campus, the fall herbicide applications were applied on October 24th. The wheat was around Feeks 1.2, and it was a little bit warmer at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And then 2 weeks later, on November 14th, the wheat was at Feeks 2, and it was about around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, that was for the early planted wheat. About 2 weeks later, the first week of December, we applied another herbicide application. The wheat was at Feeks 1.1, and it was about 38 degrees Fahrenheit for the later planted wheat. And in the middle of April, we were able to spray on April 15th. The wheat was about 10 inches tall for the early planted, and it was about Feeks 5, and it was about 67 degrees Fahrenheit. The later planted wheat was a little shorter, ranging from 5 to 6 inches. But it did reach to the same stage as Feeks 5, and again, 67 degrees Fahrenheit for the temperature. So that's kind of setting up everything and kind of explaining what we did. Sorry. But for the pictures, so this was untreated at the fall application 2, and then this is the untreated at the spring application. And then this is the fall applied husky and osprey. I know these pictures are hard to see. I tried to edit them so you can see, but this is pretty clean. You can see the weed pressure here, and then you can see the weed pressure here. And now we'll kind of go into the key research findings. So unfortunately, it's a good problem to have, but a bad problem to have for me. Up here at Sebrick, there was really no weed pressure. So all of the treatments were pretty much clean. I am seeing some ragweed and mare's tail poke through very sparsely throughout the plot. So after harvest, I'll go through and do a rating on those weeds. But overall, we did see no weed pressure and no injury at this location. On the other hand, at the MSU location, the fall herbicide applications that contained Osprey or PowerFlex caused some injury, probably around 8 to 10% to the wheat, which just consisted of yellowing and stunting. But they did grow out of it 14 days after application. However, by the springtime, there was no injury present, so it makes us think there's really nothing to worry about. And we also saw similar results in the year before, in 2023. And then also, the similar stunting and injury levels were found in the spring applications of Husky and PowerFlex. We can see a common theme there. I think the max injury that we've seen was about 15, and the minimal injury that we've seen was about 5. But like I said, they grew out of it within 14 days, so we should be all good there. Weed planting day also had a major effect on the number, size, and the type of weeds that needed to be controlled. Early planted wheat had more weeds that needed to be managed, but what we've seen was the canopy closure closed up faster, so a little bit of both there. Fall herbicide applications to early wheat provided greater control of winter annual weeds than applications made in the spring. That's kind of why I had this picture right here to kind of show you the fall applied Husky and Osprey, how clean it was. And this picture was taken in April at the time of spring application. Fall applications, regardless of timing, for the combinations of Husky and Osprey or Husky and PowerFlex provided wonderful control of all weeds, including annual bluegrass, and the similar results were found in 2023. In 2023, herbicide selection did not have an impact on the winter wheat yield from fall herbicides. However, the planting date did. The early planted wheat yielded approximately 20 bushels better across the board, regardless of herbicide selection. And like I mentioned earlier, within the past week, I have seen ragweed and mare's tail poke through at this location and at the Michigan State location. So after harvest, I will be doing a rating for those two weeds. Our main take-home message for you all is fall herbicide applications, particularly for early planted wheat, may be the best option as a spring weather often impacts the chance we can get out into the field. Additionally, early planted wheat will provide the greatest benefit for early canopy closure to help suppress the summer annual weeds and maximize winter wheat yield. Yeah. So that's pretty much my project. I've had a lot of fun looking at it. My dad has grown wheat ever since I was around as a baby, so I've enjoyed getting to see the research side of it. I do want to thank Dr. Sprague and then the Michigan Wheat Program for allowing me to do this project. I've had fun. I'll now take any questions that you have for me before Christy takes the floor. Yes. So last year, Christy and I just had this talk on the way up. The field was fallow last year, just because we wanted to make sure that we could get the early planted wheat in. Because I think in the past, they've had soybeans and they weren't able to get the soybeans off. So it was empty, but yeah.
Just because if we use the desiccation on the dry edible beans, it seems like we're pretty clean already.
Right. So, thanks, Rich. What Rich just brought up a point. So with dry beans, most of the time we're using desiccation, right? So a lot of times we're using some sharpen that usually will clean up, or maybe a sharpen gramoxone mix that'll provide fairly good weed control. So a lot of things that we're looking at is if you have something like sharpen, that probably gives you some residual activity, particularly of your mare's tail and things like that. But if you're not in that type of situation, if you're following soybeans or something, we get a lot of chickweed growth, henbit, some of those. Our annual bluegrass is coming up. We all know that annual bluegrass is a lot tougher to control in the fall due to once it starts to seed, it's very more difficult to control. So one of the things we're trying to do is get those fall applications out, particularly to get some of those weeds that are coming up. But with a desiccant, a lot of times we're probably getting that good the early weed control from the wheat. So, yeah, good question. Yep, Jeff.
So we're seeing more, grasses in the wheat, and a PowerFlex is a good tank mix combination, but it has a growth stage limit of 5.5. Have you done any work pushing that past that, or has there been any yield impact by pushing past 5.5 and still applying PowerFlex?
Yeah, so the question is about PowerFlex and pushing it past that later growth stage. So, Jeff, I would tell you that, you could probably get away with it a couple times, but one of the reasons that those are there is it's kind of the same thing with 2,4-D applications in the fall, right? We can get away with it sometimes, but 2 years out of 10, you're probably going to see a yield reduction. So, with our ALS inhibitors, particularly Osprey, PowerFlex, those ones, a lot of our dicambas, 2,4-Ds, a lot of the growth regulators have those earlier cutoffs because we can see some, on occasion, reductions in yield. So we usually don't want to push those too far past that. Good question. Any other questions? Phil?
Christy, all of your bluegrasses are going to be controlled with that option that you're using with the Husky and Osprey or PowerFlex, is that right?
So bluegrasses as in both rough stock and annual bluegrass? Okay. So both rough stock bluegrass and annual bluegrass are controlled very well with Osprey. PowerFlex is very good on annual bluegrass, not quite as good on your rough stalk bluegrass. So we're looking at those. We have seen that Axial Bold is good on rough stalk bluegrass, but not annual bluegrass. So we've got all these different options, and we've tried to outline in the weed control guide which weeds, winter wheat weeds are controlled best with each one of those options. So depending on what you're dealing with. Because I know windgrass, as Jeff was telling us earlier, is starting to kind of explode a little bit more in some of the different areas than what it has in the past. It's been pretty localized, but again, we're seeing more of these grasses becoming more of a problem. So we're gonna be seeing more tank mixes with things like, you know, trying to get our broadleafs with Husky, or maybe Talonor or Culex to try to get control of things like mare's tail, chickweed, a lot of those types of things with some of those grass products. As Katie mentioned, we can tend to see some injury from some of those products. Usually it's some stunting, usually some yellowing. Usually we see that outgrow it quite well. I would say though that we have seen with spring applications, if it's done under cold weather, particularly if we're looking at something like a Osprey Extra or a lot of our ALS inhibitors, we can see some yield reductions when we've really hit that wheat hard because of the cold temperatures and those ALS herbicides. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's why we usually kind of use that 50 degree as our threshold. And that was one of the main reasons why we wanted to look at more of these fall applications, because we're seeing that in the spring, you guys all know, it's very hard to find that right window when we've got dry enough conditions and the temperatures are warm enough to get those spring herbicide applications on. And I think where we probably see the most benefit is if we're planting early and we're starting to see a lot of those weeds that are emerging. Maybe not where you're able to get a good desiccation on and get some residual from something like Sharpen, but in other cases, we do see a lot of weed growth. Particularly like last year, we had a fairly warm, moist fall where we had quite a bit of emergence. And if we can get those weeds controlled when they're small, it's very helpful. As Katie said, we've looked at those plots now. We're starting to see some summer annuals, but really, you know, common ragweed is maybe this tall. It's not competitive. We might be seeing, particularly where we don't have something like a Husky in the taint mix or a Culex, we see potentially mare's tail, very small. That canopy is really holding those things back. Once we cut that wheat, we're going to start to see some of those weeds start to take off. We've also seen this year, I've seen some wheat fields where there is mare's tail above the canopy. That could easily be controlled with some of our fall herbicide applications or spring, and we've got some good products. One of the issues we do have is if people are still focusing on just using an ALS inhibitor, like a group 2 herbicide, like an Affinity broad spec, not putting something else in there, we're not going to get control because of all the ALS resistance that we have in mare's tail across the state. Yep.
Katie talked about the damage and then your percentage of 5% or whatever you said, and it recovered. Have you done any actual test of yield, if it hurt the yield at all?
Yes. Yeah. So as Katie mentioned, we did see some injury, right? So anywhere from 5 to 10%, maybe 15%. It outgrows it. Last year, and we've done this a number of years for different things, but last year with our yield results, there was no differences in any herbicides, okay? So even honestly, most of us know that in wheat, if we get a good wheat stand, a lot of times that can help outcompete those weeds, and that wheat doesn't see much of a yield reduction. And a lot of times it depends on what the weeds are that you're trying to compete with. Things like rough stalk bluegrass are going to cause a yield reduction. Things that are going to be above the canopy are going to be an issue. So that wheat usually recovers, and we have not seen any yield reductions from that, 5 to 10, 15% of stunting and yellowing. So, yep.
What are your options when you seed it with red clover?
Okay, so what are our options if you're frost seeding with red clover? So our options for frost seeding with red clover is mostly fall herbicide applications. With spring herbicides, the only two that are not going to really impact that clover are going to be Axial Bold and MCPA. Now, many of you have probably used MCPA. you probably don't see a whole lot of weed control from it, right? I mean, it's going to be very selective on what weeds it controls, and it's probably not going to be the best. So one of the things that we have seen is with a lot of our fall herbicide applications, like we can apply something like Husky in the fall, frost seed red clover, we will see some bleaching on that clover leaf, but in general, we don't see much of a stand or biomass reduction. So we do get that taking off. So a lot of our fall herbicide applications allow us to have that frost-seeded red clover. The ones where we have a little bit more, maybe some reductions in yield or of clover, or reductions in clover, and maybe some stunning, are going to be some of the ospreys and some of those. What we've tried to do in the weed guide, as you look at each one of the different products that you're interested in, we try to tell you whether it's safe to frost seed red clover from a fall application or a spring application. And again, most of the time we can't use a spring application, but some of those fall applications we can use.
How about after harvest?
After harvest, did I plant you here? Because that was what I was going to talk about next, okay? So, as we talked about, right, after we harvest, what are the weeds that usually show up in our wheat fields? Lamb's quarters, right? Common ragweed. And what's probably the number one pain that's going to be very more of an issue? Mare's tail, right? So those three. So for several years, and again, I want to thank the Michigan Wheat Program, helped fund some like post-harvest applications. And basically what we saw, our best options for controlling all three of those weed species are usually an application of Liberty. And again, after you cut the wheat, you want that weed to kind of start to regrow before you make those applications. So usually, maybe 2 to 3, 4 weeks after that weed is cut. We've seen Liberty has worked well. Liberty combinations with other herbicides have worked well. Sharpen, either at 1 ounce or 2 ounces plus Roundup, including a methylated seed oil. And AMS with that has worked well to control the mare's tail, the common ragweed, and also the lamb's quarters. Now, a lot of times you're trying to control those weeds that are out there, and then you might be deciding you want to plant a cover crop, right? So that sets us up for the next thing. So I might have Kaddi go ahead and advance this. So over the last, I think, 3-4 seasons, again, with some funding provided by Michigan Wheat, and then also with Project Green, we had done some work where we were looking at herbicide applications and then planting cover crops. The other thing that we did is look at post-harvest herbicide applications and planting cover crops immediately after those. So trying to clean those up, get those cover crops out. So we've had 9 different cover crops that we've planted. The grasses, things like annual ryegrass, oats, cereal rye, crimson, and then we've looked at the clovers, crimson, red clover, oilseed radish, mustard species, rapeseed, and then Austrian winter peat. So if you look at this is kind of based on 2 years data with 5 locations, so we feel pretty confident about this. Basically, as you would expect, if you're using glyphosate or Roundup, you're going to be able to plant any of those covers. And again, that's going to take out any of that volunteer wheat. So usually we want that to let the wheat come up after 2 to 3 weeks, spray it, and then we can plant those covers. If we're trying to plant any of those covers, we can also use Liberty. We can use 32 or 43 fluid ounces, and remember I told you that's going to do a good job at controlling the lamb's quarters that are out there, also the mare's tail, and also the common ragweed. So we've got that as an option. We also looked at 240. In this case, we looked at 2 pints of Enlist 1. The grasses were safe to plant. We actually had some establishment of some of the clovers. So again, basically we sprayed and we planted immediately. We did see a little bit of injury, and the stand might be lower, but we had no impact on biomass. So that was with the clovers, the oilseed radish, the mustards, and the rapeseed. we did see that it really affected the winter pea from an establishment standpoint. Looking at sharpen, all three grasses were safe to plant after sharpen applications at both rates. If we use the lower rate, we actually had crimson and red clover that would establish, but again, we had maybe some injury initially, but there was no reductions in biomass at the end of the fall. We did see that it really impacted our oilseed radish, mustard, and also the dwarf Essex rapeseed, and then not as much of an impact on the pea. And then you can see here, as we went to a higher rate, we had much less establishment with many of those broadleaf and legume cover crops. So this is kind of our recommendations here as far as burn downs afterwards. Again, we've looked at things like the dicambas, the 2,4-Ds, a lot of those to control mare's tail, and our best options are looking at Liberty or including sharpen with glyphosate for control of those. Any other questions that anybody might have on weed control in winter wheat? Yes?
Has there been much research, or do you anticipate anything as far as drone applications?
Another good question. I'm good at setting you guys up here. So actually, we do have a project that we're going to be doing some drone applications probably in 2 weeks, trying to control water hemp in soybeans, looking at some different application rates, gallonages, so anywhere from 2 up to 5 gallons per acre to see how well we can get those applications out there and whether we're able to control things like water hemp with something like Liberty. So we're just starting on that and looking at the coverage of that. Most people have really focused on fungicide applications. We're starting to look at some of those herbicide applications. Yes?
How young can the wheat be in a fall to safely apply the husky and osprey?
So in general, I would like to see the minimum amount would be 2 to 3 leaves. So you usually want to wait 2 to 3 weeks. Usually, if you've got an early planting, you're going to want to wait 2 to 3 weeks before making that fall application. Any other? Yep.
In the plot, are you doing no-till or conventional till, and versus either or, are you getting a better till with fall burn down versus spring application?
Sure. So this particular trial was on conventional till, and the main reason for that is we wanted to make sure that we had good winter annual weed emergence. We've done some stuff with no-till, and we've done like a burn down of something like a sharpen plus Roundup before planting wheat. That's really helped from a standpoint of, for example, if you're using sharpen in your desiccant for dry beans, that's really helped from a mare's tail control standpoint. It also can help with some of the other winter annuals that we might have coming up. So with our fall applications, mostly with things like Husky, Powerflex, we got to wait for the wheat to get up. And then at that time, as the wheat's coming up, we're seeing a lot more of those winter annuals come up, and that's where we're looking at that.
Question, on the bluegrass deal, I'm killing it, I'm burning it off, it comes right back, it's usually shaped out by the canopy. Is there anything that gets rid of it, period? It's obviously root-based growth and whatnot, so.
Yeah.
It isn't hurting anything, really.
Yeah, and in all honesty, probably that later kind of stuff that's getting shaded out is probably really not hurting the yield at all. We do know with some of the fall applications, especially when it's small, we're taking it out. That doesn't mean we're not getting any, potentially new emergence and causing some issues, or not issues, but showing up. But for example, we went out and looked at her plots a week ago, and anywhere where there was annual bluegrass, it's all dead, right? It's just sitting down low below the canopy. It's when it's actively competing earlier in the season, that's when we want to try to knock it back. Yep.
Have you done any study clover, the clover actually chokes out the weeds or whatever?
Okay, so the question is, have we done any studies where we've had clover choke out the weeds, right? So one of the two things you have to think about is whether you have good weed control in the fall, right? So you don't have those winter annuals that are there, because when you frost seed, that's usually, in March, and then you have to have it to get to establish. Now, with where I would see that works fairly well is when you have some of our summer annual weeds, like a common ragweed, or maybe some of our spring mare's tail that comes up. If that clover is very well established in that wheat, that can help, that can act as a suppressant, very similar to if we have a really good wheat stand. So again, that's just kind of that competition with some of those weeds. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you. And just a reminder, if you're not busy tomorrow, we have our weed tour on campus tomorrow morning, so come on down and see us there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, and thank you.